Hello, this is the flare skirt lesson. The skirt on the figure is considered a basic flare skirt. We can define the flare skirt as a skirt in which the amount of fabric at the waistline is much less than that at the hem. The fullness at the hem is formed by the depth of these flares or cones which start near the waistline. The fullness is what gives this skirt the movement, which is one of its most important features. When the wearer twirls, the skirt flies away from the body, and it swings around the legs when walking. A typical example of the basic flare skirt swings freely here. Popular variations start at locations other than the normal waistline, such as this pier style. Here the dropped waistline is slanted also. Styling at the hemline adds excitement, as in the handkerchief hem. The principle of flare may be extended further to develop full-length garments, as in the tent dress, or simply as a ruffle. In developing this skirt, we start with the position of the straight grain, which then falls to a bias to achieve the fullness. In this skirt, we start with the straight grain at the center front, which falls to a bias at the side seam. This skirt has the straight grain at the side seam, falling to bias at the center front. And this skirt has the straight grain in the princess area, falling to bias both at the center front and at the side seam. The pattern resembles the whole or part of a circle, the inner circle being the waistline and the outer edge of the circle being the hem. In comparison, the dirndl skirt is also a full skirt, but with the same amount of fullness at the waist and at the hem. The pattern resembles a square or a rectangle. It has a tubular shape, and the fall of the skirt is usually on the straight or cross grain. The flare skirt resembles a circle. It has a cone shape, and the fall of the skirt is from straight to bias grain. Our first objective in draping this skirt is to start with the straight grain at the center front, dropping off to a bias at the side seam, which meets at equal angles, forming a mitered seam. The flares or cones are to be evenly distributed. For the back and front of the skirt, prepare block 2 pieces of muslin, each the same size. For the length of the skirt, take the desired length of the skirt plus 1 inch for the hem and 6 inches for working space. Okay. For the width, the full width of the muslin. To further develop the front muslin, draw a line on straight grain 1 inch away from the edge of the muslin. Measure down from the top of the muslin 6 inches for the waist position and then 7 inches down from the waist position for the cross grain, which you draw all the way across the muslin. Now we prepare the figure. Prepare the figure for the position of the flares by placing pins at the waistline. When deciding the position of the flares, consider the whole skirt so that you don't have flares falling on top of each other in the center front, right, and or at the side seam. Be sure they are attractively placed. You place 2 flares at the waistline and none at the side seam. Begin draping, placing the muslin on the figure with 6 inches above the waistline. Pin down the center front and place a pin to hold some of the fabric out of the way. We begin the process somewhere in the lower level, the lower hip level of the figure, smoothing over to just underneath the first pin and smoothing up to the pin. Place a pin, cut about 1 inch above the waist level, clip down to the pin at the waistline, and allow the first flare to fall into place. Place a pin on the other side of the flare, smoothing over to underneath the second pin. Place a pin, smooth up to the pin at the waist, pin, cut above the waist level, clip down, and allow the second flare to fall into place. Now at this point you must stop and compare the 2 flares. You're looking for the flare point, the position from which the flare starts, and the depth of the flare. Smoothing from the pin over to the side seam, smoothing up to the waist, and placing a pin at the waist. Now we can begin marking. Dotting the waistline beginning from the center front, cross mark the waistline at the side seam, and dot the hip to about 4 inches below the waist. Cross mark the figure at the bottom of the figure, and at the 4-inch level come out about 1/4 inch for good measure, and also 1/2 inch at the bottom of the figure. This good measure is to compensate for the stretch that will happen as the bias stretches. Now we can remove it from the figure. Begin truing with the waistline, starting at the center front, squaring a line 1 inch to the center, and then bringing the French curve or any curved ruler to follow the rest of the dots. At the side seam, start with the hip curve, blending a curved line out to the 1/4 of an inch, good measure, holding the hip curve so that it angles slightly towards the 1/2 inch out, at the bottom of the figure. All right, and if it doesn't quite match up, you can give a little more good measure. Okay. For the rest of the truing, use the yardstick, blending the straight line into the curved line. Add 1 inch seam allowance to the waist, and to the side seam. Now the cross grain serves as a cross mark when we true the back of the skirt. But because this is a bias seam, you may need other cross marks along the way. So I'll place one at the hip level and one between the cross grain and the hemline area. Now to do the back of the skirt, we start out ahead of the game by truing the front side seam to the back. Lay the front over the back, grain to grain, allowing just a little extra at the center back for any differences there might be in the figure contour. Put it in place and check to see that the straight grain of the front is on the straight grain of the back. Okay. A slight adjustment and smooth the muslin together. Pin the side seams together so that it doesn't shift in the truing. With carbon paper, we can trace the side seam starting at the waistline side seam cross mark. Carboning through the side seam to the back, and be sure to copy the cross marks and the cross grain. Before removing the pins, cut the two side seams while they are together. All right, this saves you time. and it is more accurate since both seams are exactly the same. Separate the pieces and fold back the back side seam over the front, finger creasing first and being very careful at this point because the side seam is a bias line and stretches very easily. Begin pinning together, matching the cross marks. Waistline cross mark, hip line cross mark, the cross grain, and the cross mark near the hem area. Okay. Now draw the cross grain on the back. Starting from the cross mark at the side seam. Okay, measuring from the cross mark to the hem area. To get the line on grain. Now we can begin draping the back. The back of the figure is a different shape than the front of the figure, and that will affect the flares. We place the pins at the waistline for the flare position, and we notice that the back of the waistline is smaller than the front, but not necessarily the hip line. So that when we drape the flares, you're going to look for balance. You're going to look for visual balance. That is, the back flares should appear the same depth as the front flares and coming from the same level of the body. But they may not actually be so because of the shape of the body. Now we begin draping the back by first placing the front skirt back on the figure. In the position in which it was first draped. Pinning down the center front. And adjusting the flares so they are in the position in which you drape them. Then you begin by looking at the side seam and making sure that the side seam falls plumb to the floor, not forward or back, but plumb to the floor. Place a pin in the area around the hip level, and you begin the process of draping from this point. Smoothing over, placing a pin just under the waist pin for the flare point, smooth up, pin, cut above the waistline, clip down, and drop the flare into position. Before continuing on to the next flare, compare the back flare to the front flare, again for the flare point level and the depth of the flare. Until they are visually equal. And when you are satisfied with that, you can begin draping to the next flare. Place a pin to hold the flare in position, smooth over, place a pin, smooth up to the next flare point at the waist, cut above the waist seam, clip down, and drop the flare into position. When you're dropping the flare into position, try to aim for the straight grain at the center back, right, which it is. It now has a straight grain at the center back. And go back and compare all the flares again. Right, when you're satisfied with the flare, smooth over to the center back, smooth up to the waist, place a pin, and cut away the rest of the excess. Now we are ready to mark. Okay. Mark the waistline. And cross mark the center back waistline point and dot the center back. At this point, we begin taking the hem. Okay, begin taking the hem with a yardstick from the floor up. Be sure that the yardstick does not slant in any way. It should always be at right angles to the floor. You pin at the desired skirt length and shift the figure around while you're taking the hem. Right, it's a little more difficult taking this type of hem because some of it juts out. Just watch the slant of the yardstick. Now, by rights, you should allow the skirt to hang at least for overnight before taking the hem, because most of the skirt is on the bias. And what happens to the bias? It stretches. Sometimes more than overnight has to be allowed before taking the hem, depending upon the type of fabric being used. Sometimes weights are added to help speed up the process, or hanging the skirt in a steamy shower room. The moisture in the air adds weight to the fabric and pulls down the bias at a faster rate. See, even a damp weekend is good for something. When you're finished taking the hem, then you can remove the skirt from the figure. True the back waistline, following the dots, squaring a line for the last ½ inch to the center back, and true the center back, following the straight grain. I'm just going to check to see if my markings were on straight grain. True the waistline, true the hemline, not the waistline, true the hemline in a continuous, smooth curve, following the pins, and a curved tool might help you do this a little bit better. When one pin is a little bit off, you can compensate, blending from one pin to the other. Now you may notice a strange looking dip in the hem of the skirt. That happens because of the stretch of the bias. And on some fabrics, you get even more of a distortion because of the hang. In chiffon, for example. Always square your lines to the fold. Give 1 inch seam allowance. And cut. 1-inch seam allowance to the center back. And to the waistline. Fold the center back, finger creasing, and fold back the hem, being very careful in the finger creasing process, because most of the hem again is bias and you don't want to stretch it out of shape. Place the pins vertical to the hem. Now we're ready to place the skirt back on the figure. All right, place the skirt back on the figure as it was draped, and we have a very pretty skirt. Compare it to the stripe. The next demonstration is a flare skirt with flare at the side seam. Again, we will drape a balanced skirt starting with the straight grain at the center front, draping over to the bias at the side seam. This method will enable you to put flare at the side seam wherever flare at the side seam is required. The skirt on the figure is partially draped with the first flare. Begin draping to the second flare with the same process, smoothing over at the hip level, placing a pin just under the position for the flare, smooth up to the waist pin, cut over, already done that, clip down, and drop the flare into position. Don't forget to go back and compare the two flares. You can feel the depth of the flares with your hands. And also the beginning of the flare. Place a pin when you're satisfied and begin again to the side seam. Smoothing over, placing a pin, smoothing up to the waist, placing a pin, cut over, clip down, and drop the flare into place. Again, comparing the amount of flare from the side seam cone to the first two. Now we're ready to mark. Begin marking from the waistline to the side seam. Cross mark the waist and side seam point. I have to do some adjustment. And dot the side seam, marking through the center of the flare. Because when we trace the front part of the skirt to the back piece of muslin, the other side of the flare will be on the back skirt. Remove from the figure and true. Beginning at the waistline, squaring a line 1 inch over from the center front. And using your curved tools, hip or French curve, to make a nice smooth line for the waistline. The side seam already has a flare, so we don't have to give good measure. And if there's a flare there, you won't have a curve. So the side seam is trued with a straight ruler. Follow the dots and use your discretion if one of the dots is out of position. Add 1 inch seam allowance. To the side seam and to the waistline. Cut the waistline seam allowance, but not the side seam allowance. And block the front piece to the back piece. Again, allowing a little bit of muslin to the center back for any changes that the shape of the figure will require. Place a cross mark, again between the waistline and the cross grain line. The cross grain line will serve as its own cross mark, and a cross mark between the cross grain and the hemline area. The side seam is traced through just like the first muslin that we did, and you will follow the same process. We begin draping the back by pinning the back over the front, as in the first example, and placing the front back on the figure. Place the front on the figure in the same position in which you draped it. Pinning the flare points back on the waistline carefully. Two flares fall into position. Very loosely pinning away the hanging material so that you can work on the side seam. All right, the side seam is a flare. Pull out the flare. And looking at it directly straight on, be sure that the side seam hangs straight so that the flare doesn't fall forward or to the back or curling around. The side seam must fall straight. Once it's in place, you can begin the process again. Putting a pin to hold the side seam in position, smoothing over, smoothing up, cutting over, clip down, and drop the flare into place. Compare the three flares, and when you're satisfied, you can continue the process draping over. I will now demonstrate the draping of the flare skirt, starting with the length grain at the side seam, draping to bias at the center front. The preparation of the muslin is similar to the first demonstration in that you measure the length the same way and use the full width of the muslin. The length grain, however, starts at the side seam with the cross grain at the hip level all the way across, and the waist level about 6 inches down from the top of the muslin. Different from the first demonstration, we begin with another grain line 2 inches away from the length grain, parallel all the way up from the hip line to the waist. Fold back on the length grain. And we begin draping. From the waistline at the side seam down to the 7-inch hip level, and down the rest of the side seam. The object here is to use the 2-inch guideline, smoothing over from the side seam so that the 7-inch hip level is parallel to the floor, and then smoothing straight up the figure. That means releasing the pin at the waistline so that the guideline can go straight up the figure. Okay. Then smooth a little bit further to just under the first flare point at the waist. Smooth over, smooth up, place a pin to hold it in position. Slash down to the pin, cut away the excess at the waistline, and allow the first flare to fall into position. Smooth over, first placing a pin to hold the flare in position. Smooth over at the hip level. Smooth up to the next flare point at the waist. And allow the next flare to fall into position. Slash down, cut over, and make any adjustments. Testing again to make sure that the amount of flare feels the same in your hand. Now place a pin to hold the flare in position, smooth over to the center front, smooth up the center front to the waistline, and place a pin. Now sometimes because of the shape of the figure, at the side seam you will get a tiny little pinch. Right, smoothing straight up the side seam so that there aren't any lumps on the side seam. You will wind up with a little pinch on very shaped figures. Right, now you're ready to mark the figure. Dotting the waist in the middle of the tape. Cross mark waist and side seam. Then dot down the side seam to the 7-inch hip level. Dot the center front. And at the bottom of the torso, allow the half-inch good measure so that when the bias stretches or any other part of the draping affects the center front seam, you will have the amount necessary to compensate. And take it off the figure for truing. For the side seam, which is now a slightly curved line, use the hip curve, shifting the curve until it falls on most of the dots to make a nice smooth line into the 7-inch hip level. Follow the curve of the dots for the waistline, starting at the side seam. Until you get near the center front, where you must have a line that's square to the center front. That means drawing in the center front line first. All right, now these are the dots that are the original center front, and here's the 1/2 inch out for good measure. So I start from the waistline, placing the ruler so that you can come out to the 1/2 inch good measure, you can see here. And draw in the center front. Now you can complete the waistline squaring over from the center front for at least 1 inch before blending into the curved line. Add 1 inch seam allowance to the center front. Waistline, and to the new curved side seam. Now the procedure for the back is the same as that in the first demonstration, in that you will trace the front side seam onto the back piece, tracing the new curve, cross-marking the hip level, tracing the hip level, drawing the hip level all the way across, and being sure to cross-mark the waistline. And the back is draped from the side seam over to the center back, following the same procedures as in the first demonstration. Again, when you're draping the back, you will probably, depending on the shape of the figure, have a slight pinch falling into the waistline as on the front. Placing this back on the figure. Flare points in position. The pinch. and that is the draping of the flare skirt, starting with straight grain at the side seam from the hip level down. As you see, the straight grain is really about 2 inches away from the side seam in this case. The next demonstration is the flare skirt with the straight grain in the princess seam area. As you can see, the skirt drapes off to bias at the center front and to bias at the side seam. Since we will start draping from the position of the straight grain, the muslin is prepared in a slightly different way. Instead of using the 1 inch from the edge for the straight grain, we begin with the straight grain down the center of the muslin and the cross grain at the 7 inch down from the waistline level. To make it a little bit easier to drape, I'm going to slash almost all the way to the waistline point to make it easier to place on the figure. We begin by placing the straight grain on the figure in the area of the princess seam. The exact placement will vary from figure to figure. Place the straight grain straight down, smoothing over a little bit to one side at the hip level and to the other side before you begin the process of draping the flares. Now we have two directions to drape, because we begin draping always from the position of the straight grain. So begin draping towards the center front first, smoothing over, placing a pin, smooth up to the first flare point at the waist, cutting over, clipping down, and dropping the flare. Place a pin, smooth over to the center front, smooth up, cut over, and pin the excess out of the way. Now we drape the second half, starting again from the position of the straight grain, smoothing over, smoothing up to the flare point at the waist, cutting over, clip down, and dropping the flare into place. Compare the two flares before continuing to the side seam. When you're satisfied, place a pin, smooth over to the side seam, Smooth up to the waist. Cut over, and if there is flare at the side seam, clip down and drop the flare into place. Compare with the other two flares, and now we can mark. Mark the center front by dotting. Cross mark at the waist. Allow the good measure at the bottom of the figure, a ½ inch. Dot the rest of the waistline. And dot the flare through the center, stopping somewhere near the bottom of the figure. If you continue all the way down, you get some distortion. Now we can take it off the figure for truing. This is the finished front, and the back will be draped starting the same way that we started all the other skirts, pinning the front muslin onto the back muslin. And this time we don't have a straight grain to draw. We'll draw that in later on.